As Diego's piercing stare locked onto mine, I knew he was aware of my trespass into the forbidden room. The haunting presence of the mannequin would never let me forget. I was thrilled to move into my new apartment, eager for a fresh start. My roommate, Diego, seemed a bit odd but harmless. He had a reserved demeanor and a penchant for keeping to himself, which I didn't mind. Our interactions were polite but minimal. One thing that struck me as peculiar was the locked room in the apartment. Diego mentioned it was used for storage, containing personal and old family items. He asked me not to enter it, and although I found it strange, I respected his request. Little did I know, that room held secrets far darker than I could have imagined. One night, while Diego was out, I was reading in the living room when I heard strange noises coming from the locked room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sounds persisted. It was as if someone was dragging furniture across the floor, accompanied by faint murmuring. My curiosity and fear grew with each passing moment. I tried to ignore the noises, reminding myself of Diego's request, but the sounds grew louder and more disturbing, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. My heart raced as I weighed my options. Should I respect Diego's privacy, or should I investigate the source of the noises? The urge to uncover the truth finally overpowered my hesitation. I grabbed a hairpin from my dresser, my hands trembling as I approached the locked door. The strange noises continued, growing louder and more unsettling. I knew I had to see what was inside. With a steady hand, I picked the lock, feeling a mix of fear and exhilaration as the door creaked open. The air inside was cold and musty, and the sight before me was nothing short of chilling. The room was covered in strange symbols, and unlit candles lined the walls. In the center of the room stood a mannequin, dressed in old, tattered clothes that seemed eerily lifelike. The sight of the mannequin sent shivers down my spine. Its lifeless eyes seemed to follow me as I stepped further into the room. The symbols on the walls and the arrangement of candles hinted at something dark and ritualistic. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I had disturbed something that should have been left alone. Suddenly, I heard the apartment door open. Panic surged through me as I realized Diego had returned. I quickly backed out of the room, closing the door behind me as quietly as possible. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to act naturally, praying that Diego wouldn't notice anything amiss. Diego entered the apartment and immediately looked at me with a piercing gaze. It was as if he knew exactly what I had done. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could feel his suspicion weighing heavily on me. I struggled to maintain my composure, my mind racing with fear and guilt. The noises from the locked room became more frequent and disturbing after that night. I would hear the same dragging sounds and murmuring, often accompanied by a cold, eerie feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The mannequin's presence haunted my thoughts, its lifeless eyes a constant reminder of what I had uncovered. Sleep became impossible as the disturbances grew louder and more insistent. My fear and paranoia escalated, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the mannequin standing there. Diego's behavior also became more unsettling, his interactions with me filled with a quiet intensity that made my skin crawl. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The fear and anxiety were overwhelming, and I felt trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The only solution was to leave, to get as far away from the locked room and its dark secrets as possible. I began packing my belongings, my movements hurried and frantic. Every noise, every shadow seemed to heighten my sense of urgency. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't shake the sensation that the mannequin's eyes were following my every move. As I carried the last box to the door, I glanced back at the apartment one final time. The fear of what might happen if I stayed any longer pushed me forward. But just as I was about to step outside, I saw it. The mannequin standing in the hallway, its lifeless eyes locked onto mine. I froze, paralyzed by fear. The sight of the mannequin was the final straw. I bolted out of the apartment, my heart racing, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove away, the image of the mannequin seared into my mind. The relief of leaving was immense, but the fear and dread lingered. The experience left a lasting impact on me. The memory of that night, the strange noises, and the mannequin's haunting presence stayed with me. The sense of vulnerability and danger I felt in that apartment was something I couldn't easily forget. I often wondered what Diego was doing in that locked room and what those strange symbols and candles signified. The unresolved mystery gnawed at me, but I knew I would never find the answers. The fear of what I had uncovered was too great. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, especially in unfamiliar places. The memory of the mannequin and Diego's piercing stare haunts me, a chilling reminder of the night I unlocked a door that should have remained closed. The experience taught me to be more cautious about my living arrangements and to always trust my instincts. The terror of that night, the haunting presence of the locked room, and the unknown dangers will stay with me forever. But wait, there's more. Brace yourself for the next spine-chilling tale. And if you're enjoying the scares, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments. Story 2. The voice grew louder, calling my name from the wall, until I couldn't take it anymore. Banging on the wall, I felt a chill as the voice suddenly stopped, leaving a haunting silence in its wake. I moved into the apartment expecting a quiet life with my new roommate, Bruno. He was a reserved guy, often keeping to himself and spending long hours in his room. Our interactions were cordial but minimal, and I appreciated the peace and quiet of our living arrangement. The apartment was modest, with thin walls that offered little privacy. Despite this, it felt like a good place to live, and I settled into my new routine without much trouble. Little did I know, the peace I enjoyed would soon be shattered by an eerie and persistent disturbance. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a voice coming from the wall that separated my room from Bruno's. At first, I thought Bruno was on the phone, the muffled sounds of a conversation drifting through the thin walls. The words were indistinct, but it was clear someone was talking. I didn't think much of it and went asleep, brushing it off as a late-night call. But over the next few days, the voice continued. Sometimes it was soft and conversational, other times more urgent, but always coming from the same wall. My curiosity grew, and so did a sense of unease. As the weeks passed, the voice became louder and more insistent. It was no longer just background noise. It was something I couldn't ignore. The feeling that something wasn't right settled in my mind, but I still tried to convince myself it was just Bruno on the phone. The voice's consistency and increasing volume each night began to disturb my sleep. I found myself lying awake, straining to make out the words. My irritation grew alongside my curiosity, but I hesitated to confront Bruno, not wanting to seem paranoid. The voice grew louder, its tone shifting from a murmur to something more demanding. I couldn't make out the words, but the intensity was unmistakable. I decided to confront Bruno, hoping for a simple explanation that would put my mind at ease. "Bruno, do you talk on the phone late at night?" I asked one morning, trying to sound casual. He looked at me, confusion clouding his eyes. "No, I don't." "Why?" he replied, his voice calm but puzzled. I explained what I had been hearing, but he insisted he hadn't been talking to anyone. The denial left me more unsettled than before. If it wasn't Bruno, then who or what was making those noises? As the days went by, the voice seemed to mock my attempts to ignore it. It grew louder, filling my room with a presence that felt almost tangible. Sleep became difficult, and I found myself on edge, listening for the next occurrence. I started to doubt my sanity, wondering if I was imagining things. A particularly loud night led me to record the sounds, hoping to capture proof of what I was experiencing. Listening to the recording the next day, I felt a chill as the voice was clearly audible, though still indistinct. One particularly restless night, the voice took on a new, terrifying form. It began calling my name, softly at first, then louder and more insistent. The sound pierced the quiet of the night, sending chills down my spine. I tried to block it out, covering my ears with a pillow, but it was no use. The voice seemed to come from inside my head, relentless and inescapable. Desperation drove me to Bruno's room, intending to confront him directly. But when I opened his door, his room was empty. My heart pounded as I realized the voice was coming directly from the wall. There was no source, no logical explanation, just the disembodied calling of my name. The voice's tone changed, becoming more urgent and menacing. It felt as if it was trying to convey something important, something I couldn't understand. The sense of dread grew stronger, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, unable to sleep. The voice continued to call my name, each repetition driving me closer to the edge of sanity. The fear was overwhelming, and I knew I had to do something to stop it. Fear gripped me as I stood alone in the darkened hallway. The voice continued to call my name, each repetition more insistent than the last. Desperate, I ran back to my room and banged on the wall, hoping to silence the torment. The voice stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was almost as unsettling as the noise. The stillness pressed in around me, heavy and oppressive. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and groan of the apartment magnified by my fear. The next day, Bruno was gone. He left a note saying something in the wall was trying to reach him and that he couldn't stay any longer. His sudden departure left me with more questions than answers. What had been happening in our apartment? Determined to find answers, I started researching the history of the apartment. I discovered that previous tenants had reported similar experiences, hearing voices and feeling a presence in the walls. The stories were eerily similar to mine, and they filled me with a deep sense of dread. I realized that whatever was in the wall had targeted Bruno and me, and it wasn't going to stop. The fear and confusion grew stronger, and I knew I had to leave the apartment before it consumed me. The apartment has been silent since Bruno moved out, but the memory of the voice in the wall haunts me. The experience left a deep mark, and I can't shake the feeling of being watched, especially at night. I often reflect on those weeks, trying to make sense of what happened. The unresolved mystery of the voice, Bruno's abrupt departure, and the oppressive atmosphere in the apartment all contribute to a lingering sense of dread. The fear has stayed with me, a shadow in the back of my mind. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the potential dangers hidden in seemingly normal places. The experience taught me to trust my instincts and to investigate anything unusual, no matter how trivial it may seem. I decided to seek professional help to cope with the trauma. Talking about my experiences and understanding the psychological impact helped, but the fear lingers. The haunting presence of the wall and the memory of the voice continue to affect me. The terror of that voice, the feeling of being targeted by something unseen, and the haunting presence of the wall will stay with me forever. The apartment, once a place of peace, became a site of fear, and the memory of those nights still sends chills down my spine. Ready for another dose of fear? Stay tuned for the next terrifying story. Subscribe and tell us which story scared you the most. Story 3. As Alex joined the circle of robed figures in the park, the eerie chanting sent chills down my spine. I knew then that I had to leave before he discovered I had followed him. I had just moved into a shared apartment with a guy named Alex. He was friendly enough, and we got along well. He had a few strange habits, but nothing that seemed too concerning at first. One thing that did catch my attention, though, was his tendency to leave the apartment in the middle of the night and return only at dawn. Initially, I brushed it off as a quirky part of his routine. Maybe he was a night owl or had some late-night hobby. I didn't think much of it, preferring to enjoy the peace and quiet of the apartment during those hours. Little did I know, Alex's nighttime activities were far more sinister than I could have imagined. Over time, Alex's midnight departures became more frequent and regular. I would hear the soft click of the front door closing around midnight and the creak of the floorboards as he tiptoed out. He always returned around dawn, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was none of my business. But the more I noticed it, the more it nagged at me. What could he possibly be doing at that hour, every night? The curiosity grew, mingling with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The situation became harder to ignore when I started hearing whispers and faint, unidentifiable sounds from his room before he left. It was almost as if he was talking to someone, but I never heard anyone else enter or leave the apartment. My imagination ran wild, filling the silence with unsettling possibilities. Finally, the curiosity became too much to bear. I had to know what Alex was up to. The mystery of his nocturnal activities consumed my thoughts, making it impossible to focus on anything else. I decided that the next time he left, I would follow him and uncover the truth. One night, I heard the familiar sounds of Alex getting ready to leave. I waited until he was out the door and then quietly slipped out after him, keeping a safe distance. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed him through the darkened streets, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might discover. He led me to a nearby park, its deserted paths illuminated only by the pale glow of the moon. I hid behind a tree, watching as he approached a group of people dressed in dark robes. They formed a circle and began chanting in a language I couldn't understand. The scene was surreal and terrifying. The chanting grew louder, filling the night air with an eerie resonance. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched the ritual unfold. My fear intensified with each passing moment, and I knew I had to leave before I was discovered. I carefully retraced my steps, making my way back to the apartment with my heart still racing. Back in the safety of my room, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The image of Alex and the robed figures replayed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the night's events. I realized that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to do something. When Alex returned, he acted as if nothing unusual had happened. His nonchalance was almost more disturbing than the ritual itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The fear and anxiety gnawed at me, making it hard to concentrate on anything else. I decided to confide in a close friend, hoping for some perspective. When I told him about the ritual, his reaction was immediate and serious. "You need to move out," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Whatever they're doing, you don't want to be a part of it." The decision to leave was not an easy one, but my friend's words solidified my resolve. The next morning, I began packing my belongings, each movement filled with a sense of urgency. The thought of Alex finding out terrified me, but I knew I had to act quickly. As I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric set my nerves on edge. The fear of being discovered kept me moving, my heart pounding with each step. The last night in the apartment was the longest of my life. I lay awake, listening for any sign that Alex knew what I was planning. My anxiety was a constant companion, making it impossible to relax. I kept the packed bags close, ready to leave at a moment's notice. In the early hours of the morning, I heard Alex's footsteps approaching my room. My breath caught in my throat as he stopped outside my door. For a moment, I thought he might come in, but then he continued down the hall. The tension was unbearable, and I knew I couldn't stay another night. As soon as dawn broke, I grabbed my bags and left the apartment. I didn't stop to look back. My only thought was to get as far away as possible. The fear of what might happen if Alex discovered my departure spurred me on, and I didn't slow down until I reached my friend's place. The experience left a lasting impact on me. The memory of the night ritual and the fear it instilled stayed with me, a constant reminder of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly normal situations. I resolved to avoid any further contact with Alex and stayed away from that park, the thought of it still sending shivers down my spine. Reflecting on the events, I couldn't help but wonder what Alex and the group were doing. The unanswered questions haunted me, adding to the sense of unease. I decided to be more cautious about my living arrangements in the future, trusting my instincts and investigating anything unusual. The fear lingered, manifesting in nightmares and a constant sense of vigilance. I sought professional help to cope with the trauma, hoping to find some peace. The experience taught me to listen to my gut and prioritize my safety above all else. The terror of that night, the haunting presence of the robed figures, and the fear of what might have happened if I stayed will stay with me forever. The memory of those nights still sends chills down my spine, a dark chapter in my life that I will never forget.